In this set of slides, I'm going to talk about a sampling of personality traits that are commonly studied by social psychologists. These are all single trait measures. In other words, in studies, social psychologists most frequently pick one very narrow personality trait to see how it is related to the social behavior that's being studied. The traits that I'm going to talk about in this set of slides include self-esteem, self-monitoring, locus of control, and intellectual humility. Self-esteem is probably the most widely studied personality trait by social psychologists, and it's been around for a long time. There have been many studies on self-esteem going all the way back into the 1950s. Now, the things that influence a person's self-esteem can be quite different in individualist versus collectivist societies, but essentially, no matter where you are, self-esteem refers to your overall sense of self-worth. How good do you feel about yourself? Studies show that we are very strongly motivated to maintain a high self-esteem, a good sense of ourselves, and we'll go to great lengths to avoid things that threaten that. In the textbook, you're going to read about something called self-handicapping, which actually hurts our behavior, but allows us to preserve some sense of self-esteem. So in the 2020 presidential election, before the election actually took place, Donald Trump spent a lot of time telling people that if he lost the election, the only reason he could have lost is because if cheating occurred and the election was rigged against him. And then when in fact he did lose, this enabled him to have an excuse for his failure and to allow him to maintain a sense of feeling good about himself. And in fact, making him feel like he had the moral high ground because he was the victim. He was the person who had been wronged. So self-handicapping is something that we frequently do, and it's counterproductive. It actually hurts your performance, and you'll read about several examples of this in the textbook, but it can make us continue to feel good about ourselves. Now, high self-esteem, extraordinarily high self-esteem, can lead to narcissism. And you're going to be reading a bit about narcissism in the textbook as well. But narcissism is unrealistically high self-esteem. And this leads to aggressiveness and interpersonal difficulties because, let's face it, if you think you're the greatest person around, you're going to become furious whenever other people don't seem to recognize that and treat you accordingly. But for the most part, having normally high self-esteem has real benefits. It facilitates initiative, resilience. You have more pleasant feelings. So basically, it keeps you striving, keeps you feeling good about ourselves. Low self-esteem, on the other hand, can lead to depression, drug abuse, all kinds of unpleasant things. Self-esteem is kind of a multi-dimensional trait. In other words, you can feel high self-esteem for different reasons. Perhaps you are really intelligent, and so you have high self-esteem because of how smart you are. Or perhaps you're physically quite good looking, and this makes you feel good about yourself. Or maybe you're a great athlete, or you have some sort of artistic talent. All of those are ways in which a person can feel good about themselves. And there are, in fact, very specific measures of self-esteem. For example, there's a measure of body esteem that assesses the extent to which you have high self-esteem based upon how good you feel about your physical appearance. The more common measures of self-esteem, however, are what we call global measures of self-esteem. They try to get an overall sense of how high or low your self-esteem is without worrying too much about exactly which area of life that's coming from. One of the oldest and still most popular measures of self-esteem is the Rosenberg self-esteem scale, which was developed way back in 1965. And as you can see on the slide here, you read a series of questions that you agree or disagree with on a 4-point scale, and your score on the overall scale indicates your level of self-esteem. Another very popular personality trait studied by social psychologists is something called self-monitoring. Self-monitoring is a personality trait that measures the extent to which people are sensitive to the ways in which they express and present themselves in social situations, and their ability to monitor how other people are reacting to them and then adjust their performance based on this feedback from others. So if you walk into a room and you're talking to people and you have a good sense of how those people are responding to you and what those people are expecting of you, and you're good at kind of changing your behavior to meet those expectations, you would be high in self-monitoring. The picture you see on the slide here is a chameleon, and I've selected that because chameleons, of course, are good at changing color and blending in with the background. Well, in some ways, the person who's a high self-monitor is like a chameleon. They're very flexible in social situations. They can read the room pretty well, and they're good at adjusting to whatever circumstances they find themselves in. Whether you're high or low in self-monitoring predicts a lot of things about you. For example, the type of ads that will be effective. If I'm trying to sell you a car, if you're a high self-monitor, an ad might be more influential if it shows you ways in which you can use the car to project an image of yourself to other people or to make a statement about yourself. If you're a low self-monitor, on the other hand, you're more interested in things like the gas mileage and the warranty. You're not thinking about the car as a way of self-presenting. So while the high self-monitor is good at adjusting to social situations, the low self-monitor is more straightforward. They just kind of plod into whatever the social situation is, and they're just themselves. They act pretty much the same way wherever they are. So for low self-monitors, their behavior almost always reflects their true attitudes and feelings. They don't worry too much about the nature of the situation, and they don't really worry too much about reading what other people want from them or expect from them. So the upside of being a low self-monitor is that what you see is what you get. The person is very genuine. There's no pretense. You're not trying to figure out what they're really like. Now, the downside of being the low self-monitor, of course, is that you can be sort of oblivious in social situations and not be quite as aware of how people are reacting to you as perhaps you might like to be. So you might be a little less socially adept if you're a low self-monitor. Now, high self-monitors are good actors. They're good at reading other people. They're good at controlling their emotional expression. They're good at learning what behaviors are appropriate in different social situations. And so the upside of being a self-monitor is you're much more socially skillful and adaptable in social situations. The downside of being a high self-monitor, however, is that if people know you well, they know that you may just be putting on a show and that it's harder for them to read what you're really feeling, what you're really thinking at the moment. But self-monitoring is related to the types of careers that you'll be good in and so forth. So you'll be reading about that in the textbook as well. Locus of control is a personality trait that is not as popular in social psychology as it was back in the middle of the last century when I was a student. Back in the 1970s and the 1980s, locus of control was a very hotly studied topic and was very popular in social psychology research. And it just sort of faded away. Not that it was disproven or wasn't useful anymore, but people just kind of moved on to other things. But it is still an important personality dimension to understand a person's behavior in social situations. Locus of control essentially measures the extent to which a person feels like he or she is in control of what happens to them. On a locus of control scale, you fill out the scale and you get a score that places you on the spectrum from being an internal to an external. A person with an internal locus of control is a person who feels like what happens to them, the outcomes in their life, are due primarily to their own efforts and talents. And so when good things happen to them, the internal takes credit for that. They feel like they have deserved the good things that have come their way. On the other hand, if bad things happen, the internal is likely to step up and accept the blame for that because they do believe that what happens in their life to a great extent is because of them. They don't think that other forces are really controlling them. The person with the external locus of control, on the other hand, feels like they don't really have that much control over what happens in their life. They perceive themselves as a pawn of the fates, or they're following God's plan, or powerful other people are calling the shots and controlling what happens to them. And so there's this feeling of, what's going to happen is going to happen. And when bad things happen to them, it's very easy for them to just kind of shrug their shoulders and say, well, it's not my fault. And when good things happen to them, they might perceive themselves as having been lucky, that it's not really something that they deserved. Now, most of us, wherever we are on this scale, keep it in the bounds of reality. Nobody is such a strong internal that if there's a terrible weather day, they go around apologizing to people because the weather's bad. And on the other extreme, even if you're a pretty extreme external, if somebody asks you to flip on the light switch to turn the lights on in the room, you don't just look at it and say, well, I don't have any control over that. If the lights are going to come on, they're going to come on. There's nothing I can do about it. So whether you're an internal or an external, you do recognize the realistic limits to that trait. But nonetheless, it does influence a lot of your social behaviors. Internals, for example, are much more likely to become activists because they believe that their efforts can pay off, that they can make change in society or in the organizations that they're part of. Externals are much less likely to get involved in these things because they just don't feel that they really are going to be able to have much impact. Intellectual humility is a fairly recent trait that social psychologists have only been studying for the last, I'd say 10 years or so. It hasn't been around very long, but it's already becoming quite popular with researchers. To help you figure out what intellectual humility is, let me start with an example. If I were to ask you this question, think about all of the disagreements that you have had with other people in the last 6 months. All of the times that you've argued with somebody or taken different sides on some issue. Now, what percentage of the time do you think that you were right? So think about that for a second. Think about all the disagreements you've had, and what percentage of the time do you think you were right? Well, when you do this in an experiment, the average response is that about 66% of the time, people think that they were right. Very few people ever say that they were right less than 50% of the time. So what intellectual humility is all about, really, is how often are you absolutely certain that your views are correct, that your ideas are the correct ones, and if you feel this way very strongly, you would score low in intellectual humility. Now, most people have what we call unjustifiable certainty about their beliefs. Most of us are much more sure of what we know than we should be, and this is especially true when you're asking people about their political and religious beliefs. That's one of the reasons why you're not supposed to talk about politics and religion in social situations, because it usually ends up in an argument. And the degree of expertise that a person has kind of a complicated relationship with their intellectual humility. I'll use myself as an example. I have a PhD in psychology, and I've been a psychology professor and a researcher for a very long time. And because of my training, I'm aware of how little I know and how the nature of knowledge can change. And so my certainty about what I know and what I don't know, I believe, has been tempered by that. And so in a general way, I probably would score high in intellectual humility, because more than many people, I'd be willing to admit that what I think about something might be wrong. On the other hand, because of my expertise in psychology, if I'm having a debate with someone else who isn't a psychologist, about some issue related to psychology, I am not going to be humble at all. I'm going to be much more confident about my opinions about the psychological issue than I am about the other person's opinions. And for me to entertain the possibility that that other person is right and I'm wrong is just not going to occur to me. So, another way to think about intellectual humility is to think about how willing you are to at least entertain the possibility that you're wrong about something. So, once again, scoring high in intellectual humility means that you're willing to at least entertain the possibility that your beliefs are incorrect. Now, in many ways, we would like to deal with people who are high in intellectual humility. They're not going to be narcissistic. They're not going to be self righteous. They're going to be open to new ideas. They're going to be curious. So, in most ways, I think being high in intellectual humility is a desirable trait. Perhaps not surprisingly, extreme political views are associated with less intellectual humility. People on the far right or on the far left who hold very extreme political opinions tend to be much more certain that their opinions are the correct ones, and they do tend to score lower on measures of intellectual humility. People who are a little bit more toward the middle tend to score higher on intellectual humility and don't hold views that are quite so powerful and confident. And this isn't a liberal versus conservative thing. People on the far left and people on the far right are sort of equally low in intellectual humility. Similarly, extreme religious views are also associated with less intellectual humility. It's not that religious people are lower in intellectual humility than people who aren't religious. It has to do with the extremity of your religious views. So if you're a real fundamentalist, and it really doesn't matter what the religion is, extreme religious views are associated with lower intellectual humility. You absolutely know that your religion is the correct one and that your views are the right one, and you can be quite intolerant of people who are coming from a very different place. And there are a variety of other things that are associated with your level of intellectual humility. How much attention do you pay to the evidence behind factual claims? So people who are high in intellectual humility pay attention to this, and they're good at distinguishing strong arguments from weak arguments based on facts. They're also interested in the reasons why people disagree with them. So if you score low in intellectual humility, you don't really care why people disagree with you because they're just obviously wrong, and it doesn't matter why they're wrong. On the other hand, if you're high in intellectual humility and somebody's disagreeing with you, they may not persuade you that you're wrong, but you're at least a little curious as to why they disagree with you. People high in intellectual humility are also more tolerant of ambiguity. They're more comfortable just saying they don't know something. They're more comfortable being uncertain about what's true and what isn't true. People who are low in intellectual humility like answers. They're much more uncomfortable when there's ambiguity. People who score high in intellectual humility react less emotionally to information or people that disagree with them. If you're low in intellectual humility, boy, you really get steamed up when you run into somebody who's spouting something that is totally the opposite of what you believe. So your reaction is much more emotional and strong. Not surprisingly, intellectual humility is correlated with agreeableness, which is one of the big 5 personality traits you learned about in another set of slides. So people who are high in intellectual humility also tend to be more agreeable. And they're also higher in the need for cognition, the need to understand things, to know how things work. And as I already said, it's not really correlated with religiosity. So being religious or not religious is not a predictor of your level of intellectual humility. But the certainty of your views being correct, the extremity of your religious views, is correlated with intellectual humility. One other odd little tidbit about intellectual humility, there was a study where they looked at the satisfaction that people had in their heterosexual romantic relationships and how that was related to intellectual humility. And they found out that the intellectual humility of the man, but not that of the woman, predicted the satisfaction that both people had in the relationship. So basically, if the man's level of intellectual humility was high, if he was high in intellectual humility, the couple was more satisfied with the relationship than if the man was low in intellectual humility. But curiously, whether the woman was high or low in it really didn't seem to matter. It didn't seem to have that much of an effect on their relationship satisfaction. I have no way of explaining that, but I thought it was interesting and I wanted to share it with you. Now, in the world of politics, being high in intellectual humility might actually be a handicap. You're probably aware that politicians live in terror of being called a flip-flopper. In other words, if you take a position on an issue 1 year, and then 2 years later you're running in another election, and now you have a different position, people are going to attack you for that because you used to say one thing and now you're saying something else, and you're a flip-flopper, and we can't trust you. Well, a person who's high in intellectual humility is a person who is willing to change their position when they get new evidence, and therefore they are going to be more likely to be a flip-flopper. But apparently, if you're a political candidate, this can be a problem. We admire leaders who are certain and confident and don't waver. They used to make jokes about George W. Bush when he was president. I think the phrase went something like, often wrong, but never in doubt. And that kind of sums up the way we kind of feel about our leaders sometimes. And if you are high in intellectual humility, it might in fact take longer for you to make decisions. So if you're in a position of power and a decision has to be made quickly, it could be a handicap to keep wanting more information and to be wavering back and forth and seeing the gray areas. There was a study that looked at how we perceive politicians who change their minds, and we find that Republicans who score high in intellectual humility are more likely to vote for a flip-flopper than Republicans who score low in intellectual humility. But curiously for Democrats, this trait didn't seem to matter. In other words, whether they would vote for a flip-flopper or not didn't seem to be related to their level of intellectual humility. So this is another one of those fun little findings that I don't quite know what to make of it, but it was interesting enough, I think, to talk about.